Hello, this is video number 2 for the urinary system. And in this video, I want to introduce the main functional unit in the kidneys, and those are called the nephrons. And there's a fair amount of anatomy that's involved in this structure. So we'll spend some time in this video talking about that, and in future videos, we'll get into the physiology of those functional units. This is the slide that we left off with last time. We were talking about the gross internal anatomy of the kidney. There's a cortex, the outer stripe running around it. There's a medulla. And the main functional units, this is the nephron. We're going to talk about that. What are the structural components of that in a second. But I wanted to mention where nephrons are. So they're mostly in the cortex. A small bit of them dips down into the medulla. So here is the border, cortex and medulla. Most of the structure we're going to talk about is in the cortex, but pretty close to the border with the medulla. Okay, so the nephron is the main functional unit in the kidney. And what nephrons do is they receive blood through blood vessels, and they filter some materials out of that blood. And those materials enter into a set of tubes called the renal tubules. This material can pass through the tubule, and some materials that filter out will be returned back to the bloodstream. And what is not returned to the bloodstream then is the urine. And the urine then will pass all the way through this tube and end up in the collecting place, the calyces of the renal pelvis. Okay, so that's kind of the main setup for nephrons. Now, there are two types of nephrons. The most common types are what are called the cortical nephrons, and those are located in the cortex, like I just mentioned at the beginning. For those nephrons, all but the loop of Henle are in the cortex, and the loop of Henle is a structure that dips down into the medulla. The remaining 15% of nephrons are what are called juxtamedullary nephrons. These are located very close, much closer to the border with the medulla. And we'll talk about the difference in functions of those two nephrons later on. For now, we're going to consider the cortical nephrons in terms of the structure, since those are the most common type. Now, the kidneys are exquisitely powerful at their function, filtering blood. And they do that because there are more than 1 million of these blood filtration units, the nephrons, present in each kidney. So they're very efficient at carrying out that function. So what is a nephron exactly? So there are two main components to a nephron. One is called the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is a structure, basically it looks like a ball or a spherical structure. I'll show you that on a slide in a second. And this is what's going to be receiving the blood. In the renal corpuscle, there's a capsule. The book calls it the glomerular capsule. I learned it as Bowman's capsule, so I could be using either. And this capsule, basically, you can think of it as being a baseball glove, and it's going to contain within it a baseball, and that's the glomerulus. The glomerulus is a capillary bed. It's a very unique capillary bed. It has this kind of ball-like structure to it. Okay, so that's the renal corpuscle. And the renal corpuscle is where the actual blood filtration takes place. The other structure is a renal tubule. And what happens is when material gets filtered out of the blood into the corpuscle, it's going to start into the capsule. The capsule is connected to a tubule. And so material is going to start flowing through this tubule. The tubule has different segments. A proximal convoluted tubule, proximal means near to the corpuscle. Convoluted means very twisty, turny. So the proximal convoluted tubule, and I'll just call this the PCT from now on. That leads to another structure, a loop of Henle. And the loop of Henle is what dips down into the medulla. That leads to a third structure, Another convoluted tubule, this is called the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT. and then finally to a small segment called the collecting tubule. All right, so this is all continuous. The different segments here look different, so that's kind of how they're given their, how they're sectored off. Okay, so this is a diagram of a kidney, and we're focusing on the renal cortex close to the border with the medulla. Here's the cortex, here's the medulla, and here are blood vessels that are delivering blood into the renal corpuscle. So the renal corpuscle has a glomerulus. The glomerulus is the capillary bed. And then it has a glomerular capsule. That's this kind of tan-colored thing. It's surrounding the glomerulus. Okay? That's the site of filtration. Now, the glomerular capsule has two layers. An outer layer, that's the outer shell here, and an inner layer. They're called visceral, inner layer is visceral, outer layer is parietal. Parietal is the outer shell. The visceral layer forms a coating on the glomerulus. Okay? In between these two layers is a space called the capsular space. I have another illustration of that on a future slide, but just to introduce the terms, so you should know definitely all of these terms and what they mean. Okay? This is the site of filtration. Blood is going to enter into here, and it's going to exit through this visceral layer into the capsular space, and once it's there, it's going to start its pathway down the tubule. So this is the proximal convoluted tubule close to the glomerulus, and here's the loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, and this is, each of these is connected to a collecting tubule, and then that's going to lead into what's called a collecting duct. Okay? So those are the general parts of a nephron. Now let's talk about how blood is delivered to this glomerulus, and there are important features of that for the function of the glomerulus. So there's one arteriole that brings blood into the glomerulus. That's called the afferent arteriole. And there's one arteriole that drains blood from it, efferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole is larger in diameter than the efferent arteriole. So you can think of this as a highway. Here's a highway into a city, very large. It can carry a lot of traffic. Here's the city. Here's the exit from the city, the highway. It's very narrow, so it can't carry as much traffic. There's going to be a bit of a traffic jam in this city if you design it this way. And that's basically what happens in the glomerulus here. Blood flow slows down because of this narrow exit. And it also increases the pressure because of this wide inlet and narrow exit. Okay? So those vessels are important, afferent and efferent arteriole. And they're also shown on this slide, afferent arteriole in. Here's the glomerulus, efferent arteriole out. This is also showing the glomerular capsule. Here is the parietal layer, that's the outer shell. Here is the visceral layer forming a coating on all of the capillaries in the glomerulus. And here is the capsular space between those two layers. Notice that the capsular space of the glomerular capsule is continuous with the lumen of the tubule here. In this diagram, the renal tubule has been stretched out and unwound, and it's representing, this would be the PCT here. Here's the loop of Henle dipping down into the medulla, coming back out to the DCT. Here's a really short segment called the collecting tubule, and this is the collecting duct. Okay, so that's the basic structure of a nephron. Let's have a little bit more of the details about what's going on in different parts. So first of all, the glomerulus. I mentioned that is a kind of a ball, a spherical bed of capillaries lying inside of glomerular or Bowman's capsule. Blood pressure is high in these capillaries because the afferent arteriole is larger in diameter than efferent arteriole. The high blood pressure in the glomerular capillaries is an important feature of how blood filtration works. This high pressure is going to be part of a pressure gradient, which is forcing fluid out of the capillaries into the capsular space of the capsule. Okay, so that's important in the physiology of blood filtration. And a little bit more about the capsule, just to describe that. So that's encompassing the blood capillaries, the glomerulus, parietal outer layer. This is made up of a simple squamous epithelium. And a visceral inner layer. This is basically coating, you can think of it as the shrink wrap on the surface of the glomerular capsule, glomerular capillaries, and the capsular space in between. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail, what those are like. Here's the simple squamous epithelium of the outer shell of the glomerular capsule. This is just an important structural feature. It defines the outer surface of the capsule. That's the outer or parietal layer. All right, the inner layer is the visceral layer. And this is going to be stuck on the surface of the glomerular capillaries. And also, the capillaries secrete an extracellular material called the extracellular matrix. And here are the cells that are making up the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule, stuck onto the surface of the capillaries. These are a very unique type of cell called podocytes. The way they interact with the wall of the capillary is they send out these extensions from the main portion of the cell here. And they resemble foot processes, so that's why the cell has the name podocyte. Podo meaning foot. So there are all these foot processes that are attached to the surface of the capillary. Okay? Now, the visceral layer is important for filtration of blood coming out of the glomerular capillaries into the capsular space. So the podocytes, which latch onto the surface of the capillaries, have these foot processes that interdigitate. So they kind of do this. They, from neighboring cells, they interact, and they mostly interdigitate, but they create these fine spaces between the foot processes. And that's where blood is going to filter out from inside the vessel into the filtrations, into the capsular space. So these fine slits between the segments of neighboring cells are called the filtration slits. And material that gets out of the blood has to pass through those filtration slits. Okay, this is a electron micrograph just showing the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule, or Bowman's capsule. So this would be, the perspective here would be if we were inside the capsular space, looking back at the visceral membrane of the Bowman's capsule. Here is the cell body of the cells. These are all the extensions and the foot processes. You can see how they're interacting with foot processes of other cells. And it creates these very fine channels between them, the filtration slits. Okay, so the visceral layer of the capsule is involved in the filtration process by forming these fine filtration slits. And that's going to limit what can get out of the blood capillaries into the capsular space. All right, so I'm going to end this video here, and on the next video, I'll be talking a little bit in more detail about the renal tubule, the main segments of that, how it differs, and after that we can start talking about the physiology. See ya.